want to do some work for the day, we'll switch on our computer, right? And this process is otherwise known as starting the computer, right? And so we'll focus on the first part here, which is starting the computer. In reality, there are two types of starting the computer. One is us wanting to start it, or you want to boot your computer, right? So this process is called booting, and when you start your computer for the day, it's called cold boot. Right? But sometimes the computer will also say, you know what? I need you to restart your computer because we just installed something new, right? Sometimes that happens. So when that happens, you do a warm boot. Which is restarting your computer. Okay? And this warm booting is different from reviving your system after you have put it in sleep or standby mode, right? It's different because start and restarting, which is otherwise known as booting, involves 6 steps, right? So there are 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Hopefully we have enough space to write there, right? But anyway, before we go on with the 6 steps, let's focus on the main board and the hard disk drive and everything, meaning the components inside of your system unit, which is very much involved in this cold booting and warm booting, right? Now, on your motherboard, aside from the CPU and RAM and the expansion cards, you also have lots of chips. Right? These are actually integrated circuits. Right? So integrated circuits are well integrated on your motherboard, right? And on the integrated circuit, these integrated circuits or these chips have different functions. One of the chips that will be on your main board is called the ROM chip, read-only memory chip. And there are different versions of ROM chips. We have regular ROM chips, we have programmable ROM chips, we have electrically programmable ROM chip, we have electrically erasable programmable ROM chip, we have flash ROM, we have different kinds of ROM chip, right? Anyway, one type of ROM chip has this thing called the BIOS, which stands for Basic Input-Output System. So you just imagine BIOS as something being somewhere here. Let's say BIOS is here. I just put a B to denote that it's BIOS, right? So we should also put some kind of like circuitry going here, right, connecting to the RAM. Of course, RAM is on a slot. Okay, so BIOS is connected to the main board, and RAM is also connected to the main board. And once you switch on your computer, BIOS will go from one of the ROM chips, right, and into the RAM, right? So now BIOS is here. So BIOS is here. BIOS is here. So what does BIOS do? Once BIOS is loaded, which is the first step in booting, right? BIOS will perform the power on self test or post, right? I'll just get rid of all these little red letters, right? And maybe even this one, right? I'll just get rid of all these so that we can see the top part clearly, right? Power on self test or post, right? Basically, BIOS will check whether your system has enough basic devices to work for the day. Devices like input and output and etc. Right? For example, can you say something with regards to your keyboard and whatnot? So if everything is okay, we can run for the day, something like that, right? The BIOS will then load the operating system, meaning BIOS will actually go to the hard disk and then call on the OS. Hey OS, you are needed, right? Then OS will just go and be loaded to RAM, right? The third step is OS loaded, right? OS will be loaded, and the first part of OS which is loaded is called the kernel, right? So OS, what does it do once it gets there? Once it gets there, OS will perform the system configuration, right? So in other words, system will be configured. System configured by OS, right? So this is done by the OS, meaning once OS gets into the RAM, OS will then check, okay, do I have all of these device drivers, is all the system software in place, all the applications that have been installed before, is it in the correct sector and clusters, right? So OS will configure the system. All of this needs to be done by the OS. If everything is okay, then utilities will be loaded, right? Utilities. Utilities are, for example, antivirus software, time and date for your computer, right? Lots of different things which are, you can say, secondary as compared to device drivers and etc. Right? And then after all of this is done, basically your computer is already running as usual here. And so some users, they decide to put another step which is called user authentication. Right? User authenticated. Right? This is where you log in and say, this is my username, this is my password, and etc. Right? Now, if you look at this, I'm not entirely sure whether 6 steps is hard to remember or not. Right? Maybe I should put some kind of a box so that it's easier to distinguish one step to another. Right? So these are all different steps. All of these boxes here. Right? So, okay. But basically, all the odd numbered steps, 1, 3, and 5, are loading of something. Right? BIOS will be loaded, and then OS will be loaded at number 3. Utilities will be loaded at number 5. And whatever is the following even number is actually done by the loaded thing. Once BIOS is loaded, BIOS will perform the power on self-test. It is to check the hardware whether it's working well or not. We have enough things to work for the day. Once OS is loaded, it will configure the system, meaning do we have all the drivers, graphics card and everything, is it working correctly, right? Then utilities will be loaded. Of course, user authentication is not really done by the utilities, right? Because like I said, once number 5 is done, technically your computer is already switched on. And some users choose to have this step number 6. Some users do not, right? So step number 6 is not really done by step number 5, but all of the other even steps are done by the